One of our viewers asked, how do you create folds, or how do you show folds in painting? Well, we'll take a look at that one. Well, as always, it's not how to, or my intention is not to show you this is the way to do it, but to show you how to look and what to look for, because folds are different. You know, there are so many different kinds of folds. There's no predicting which way a piece of fabric is going to fall into a fold, and even when it's hanging from the window, there's no predicting. And the other thing I want to point out is the principle is the same whether you're working in oils or pastels or watercolor or gouache or acrylic. It doesn't matter what material you work with, the principles are the same. The techniques will be a little different, but the principles are the same. And so the principle is what I want to look at, is what do you look for, and then how do you respond to what you look for. Well, here are three different kinds of folds. You see they're different colors, but that doesn't matter because it's really the value that matters. You see, these are all falling into verticals, different sizes, and these are falling into different kinds of shapes. And then this is even a more complex set of folds, but they all have the same characteristic, and that is some parts of the fold fall into shadow, other parts of the fold are in light. So once again, it all comes down to what is in shadow, what's not in shadow, or what's in shadow and what's in light. Now, one way you might start drawing the fold is not to look at it as a fold. Switch your attention from the fact of fold to shape. What shape are you looking at? And so you could sort of divide. And I'm just going to briefly use this piece. We don't have time in these quick tips to do a whole painting of that, but I just want to get you started on how you look at that and how you would respond to it. And so it's shape. If I start looking at shape, I could also look at gesture. So if I started right here, for example, and look at that shape, I'm seeing that shape is moving in this direction right here. And then if I see another smaller shape, it's moving in that direction right there. And then I see that right down here we have a little triangular shape. So now we're beginning to sort of define or identify the shape we're seeing with something we know, a geometric shape. And then as it comes down here at the edge of the shadow, I'm seeing another part of that triangular shape. And then you see right in here where the parts fall into shadow, I'm seeing yet another triangular shape. So as I move throughout that piece of fabric, looking at it, if I look for those shapes, just the edges of those shapes, then that's how I would lay out the preliminary drawing. The next step, what's in shadow? Now, it's a good idea before you even begin to shape the fold, in fact, before you begin to shape anything, it's a good idea to identify what's in shadow and what's not in shadow. Now, I like to do this little thing. I like to squint, and I'm looking just at this shape. This is what all I'm going to be working with in this particular quick tip. I'm looking at that little shape, that shape right there, and I'm seeing this part of that shape is in shadow. So I would very quickly and lightly indicate that this is in shadow. Right in here, and it's falling into that kind of funnel shape. It's in shadow. And then I'm looking here as I'm moving around, and I'm seeing that shadow extends over into this part of this shape. In fact, I'm seeing that shadow extends into a great part of that shape. And so I would continue to identify what's in shadow. Then I'm seeing that there's shadow that begins to fall above this part of the shape. And so I would continue. Very light-handed when you're doing these, identifying what's in shadow. Keep it very light-handed no matter what material you're using. Now, I'm using pastels for this particular demonstration, but you could, if you're using oil, you might just use a very light oil wash. If you're using watercolor, I've found that using a dilute ultramarine blue, it works really, really well for showing what's not in shadow, what is in shadow, or for delineating what's in shadow from what's not in shadow. And then we see that this right here, in fact, all this shape falls into shadow. So very, very quickly here, I designate all that into shadow. And what I'm finding out there already about this shape, there's more in shadow than there is not in shadow. That means that most of that red is going to be very, very dark. So then the next step, and I'll just show you this quickly in just a few strokes. The next step would be to start in, what I always like to start in the darker area, which is this right in here. And so then I would use a darker red, or in this case, as I said, I'm using pastel, and this is a burnt umber pastel. It doesn't matter, just as long as it's a darker form of red. So I would use that to just begin to kind of block in that darker area. And I'm simply looking at it now, not as fold, not necessarily as color. I'm simply looking at it as value. How dark is this? 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 So I've got dark, a little bit lighter, but still in shadow, dark. And so I don't have any area right in there, in those two areas. This one and here, it's all in shadow. So then I indicate that's all in shadow. Then I come right up in here and I'm seeing that that shadow is getting more shallow. I have a little language I like to use for this. I like to refer to shadows as deep, moderate, and shallow. And so I'm seeing here deep shadow, and I'm seeing that it's deep moving to moderate here, and this is more shallow shadow. So now I have that blocked in, and I see up here it continues. That would be shallow shadow. So instead of calling it fabric, I'll call it shallow shadow. And that shallow shadow moves from shallow to deep. So if I've got to label anything, let's call it what it is. Let's call it what we're seeing. That's going to make it then easier for you to draw or to paint. Now there's just a little bit more here, and that is I'll begin to bring some of the local color into that. So in this shallow shadow we have some red, and it's we see a little bit right in here. We begin to see that go out of shallow and into light. And you see, by putting that the shadow color there first, I already have that defined. So then when I stroke this color on top of it, it still feels like shadow. But then I move the same color into the area where I didn't have any shadow indicated, and I feel the brightness of the light, which we see in that fold itself. Now, just very quickly, I put just enough here for you to get an idea of how this works. And you see, you can begin to feel that sense of fold right here. Let's move on and see. We have another area right here that falls towards light, and then we'll add more red in here. Now we see that in that more shallow area of the red, we'll see that as it has some red in it, but is a darker red. Then and with pastels, then what we would do is begin to go back with the darker color. We would, in oils and acrylics and in watercolor, we could shape these values as we go. Pastels, we need to move back and forth between the darker color and the lighter color in order to get that. And we need to get this really deep shadow formed right here, because now with that color in there, it begins to feel more like a shallow shadow right in there. In fact, I can add even a darker dark to that, and because even when you're working, regardless of what medium you're working in, you need to get your darks dark enough when you have those deep shadows, those really deep shadows. They need to be dark enough, or it's going the whole thing is going to feel anemic if you don't have your deep shadows dark enough. Now let's see, is that deep shadow dark enough? And if we've got enough in there to, let's see, this needs to be darker right over here, and then this shallow shadow gets to be a little bit more shallow right over here. We continue to work that. Now we're beginning to feel that as a fold yet. And let's see what goes above there. We've got to get that moderate shadow a little bit darker. And we'll just do a little bit of blending in here. I think you can see now where that's going, that as long as you are working with the values of the shadow, remember the deep shadow, the moderate shadow, and the shallow shadow, and then you're responding with your color according, and then what's in light, you work that according to how your eyes register it. Then you're looking at folds in such a way that you can paint or draw any fold anywhere, regardless of what color it is. So if you found this helpful, why not go to our website at dianeminds.com and look at our full-length tutorials. Every one of them deals with a composing principle that you can work in any medium, no matter what medium I'm using to demonstrate the principle with. So give that a try. And also, if you have something you'd like for me to explore in these quick tips, leave us a comment right down here and we'll put you on the schedule. There's your quick tip.